You didn't laugh because it was funny. You laughed because it followed a pattern. And when something repeats often enough, it stops being shocking. It becomes expected. Their betrayal didn't feel like a sudden strike. It felt like confirmation. People. Like the last page of a book you already knew how to read. That laugh wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was quiet, controlled, almost disappointed. And that's what unsettled them. They were waiting for a reaction. They wanted proof that they mattered enough to hurt you. They wanted tears, anger, questions, desperation. Instead, you smiled, not because you enjoyed it, but because the final piece had finally clicked into place. You didn't feel chaos. You felt clarity. And clarity has a strange way of turning pain into irony. You laughed because the signs were always there. You just chose patience over paranoia, the delayed replies, the inconsistent energy, the way loyalty slowly became conditional, the way respect disappeared when they thought you weren't watching. Wasn't one moment. It was a sequence. Betrayal doesn't happen suddenly. It develops quietly. And you noticed long before they acted. That's the part they didn't understand. They thought the betrayal would be the moment of impact. But for you, the impact had already happened weeks ago. Emotionally, you had already stepped back. Mentally, you had already recalculated. Internally, you had already accepted the truth. So when it finally happened, there was nothing left to collapse. That's why you laughed. Because they thought they were clever. They believed their performance was convincing. But you had already seen the rehearsal. You laughed because you realized how deeply they underestimated you. They assumed kindness meant blindness. They assumed patience meant weakness. They assumed silence meant ignorance. They were wrong. You weren't silent because you didn't know. You were silent because you were observing. And observation always beats reaction. You saw every contradiction, every excuse that didn't align, every shift in behavior that exposed intent. They thought you were emotionally invested enough to miss the details. But you never stop reading the room. Their betrayal wasn't intelligent. It was careless. It required you to be naive, and you weren't. You laughed because they struck someone who had already left emotionally. The betrayal arrived late. Your heart had already packed its bags. That's what spared you from heartbreak. You didn't feel shattered. You felt validated, like finally trusting your intuition. And nothing unsettles a betrayer more than realizing they were never ahead of you. They expected devastation. They expected damage. They were prepared to deal with anger, with confrontation, with messy emotions. They were not prepared for composure. Laughter changes the power dynamic. Because laughter says, you didn't do what you thought you did. They wanted pain. But pain requires attachment. And you had already withdrawn yours. You laughed because the betrayal was anticlimactic. All that effort for such a small impact. It exposed the real motivation. They didn't betray you for gain. They betrayed you for validation. They needed to feel important. They needed to feel powerful. They needed a reaction to prove their influence. And you denied them that. You didn't chase. You didn't accuse. You didn't ask why. You laughed and stepped away. That hurt more than any confrontation ever could. Because confrontation still gives them relevance. Silence doesn't. You saw the irony. They betrayed someone who never intended harm. These civilized people, they attacked loyalty because it made them uncomfortable. They sabotaged stability because chaos felt familiar to them. They didn't betray you because you deserved it. They betrayed you because your consistency made them aware of their own disorder. That realization reframed everything. You weren't angry. Well, you were amused. Because insecurity always exposes itself eventually. People, they burned a bridge you were already done crossing. They destroyed trust that no longer held weight. So the situation became absurd, and absurdity invites laughter. You laughed because betrayal reveals character, and their character wasn't powerful. It was fragile. Insecurity wrapped in manipulation, ego wrapped in performance. Once you saw that clearly, fear disappeared. You understood something crucial. They didn't betray you because you were weak. They betrayed you because your strength made them feel replaceable. People who feel secure don't sabotage loyalty. They protect it. Only those who feel inferior try to destroy what highlights their inadequacy. That truth changed how you saw them. They expected your world to fall apart. Instead, theirs cracked. Because the moment you laughed, they realized something terrifying. They miscalculated you. They thought they were dealing with the old version of you. The accommodating one, the forgiving one, the emotionally accessible one. They weren't. They were dealing with the version that no longer needed explanation. You laughed because they revealed themselves too soon. Their timing was sloppy. Their intentions leaked. And once the mask slipped, you saw how little they actually mattered. That's when detachment became effortless. People, you laughed because the ending followed logic. And when outcomes align with prediction, emotion loses its grip. They wanted drama. They wanted chaos. They wanted to feel significant in your emotional landscape. You gave them calm. A calm they couldn't decode. A calm that denied them leverage. You walked away quietly. And that silence became unbearable for them. Because silence forces reflection. You laughed because you knew something they didn't. You always recover stronger. Pain doesn't consume you. It sharpens you. Betrayal didn't weaken you. It clarified your boundaries. And that inner stillness, that emotional economy made them uncomfortable. Because rage is predictable. Detachment isn't. You laughed because betrayal freed you. Freed you from assumptions, from misplaced loyalty, from emotional labor that went unreciprocated. Sometimes betrayal isn't an ending, it's a release. And once that weight dropped, you laughed at how heavy it had been. You realized how much space they occupied without earning it, how much access they had without deserving it. You laughed because perspective shrank them. They weren't significant. They were familiar, and familiarity can be misleading. Betrayal didn't diminish you. It revealed how small they always were. That was almost amusing. You laughed because you didn't need revenge. Revenge implies emotional investment. You were already beyond that. This wasn't about punishment. It was about closure. And closure doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it sounds like a quiet laugh, a signal to yourself that the chapter is complete. You notice the panic in their eyes. Betrayers expect retaliation. They expect damage control. They don't expect dignity. Your composure told them they no longer had influence, and when influence disappears, so does relevance. You stop negotiating emotionally, and when negotiation ends, distance becomes permanent. People, you laugh because their actions were never about you. They were about their own void. You didn't lose value. They lost access. And access, once revoked, is rarely restored. They wanted to matter. They wanted their betrayal to be a turning point in your life. Realizing it barely scratched your surface, destroyed the fantasy they had built. Your laughter closed the door. Your silence locked it. And your absence began to echo. You didn't need explanations. Their behavior wrote the entire story. The betrayal didn't end you. It ended the illusion. And that clarity felt lighter than any apology. You laughed because you finally understood. They weren't malicious because you were weak. They were threatened because you were solid. Secure people don't sabotage stability. Only unstable ones do. Once you saw that, their actions lost emotional weight. They became predictable, almost textbook. You laughed because they expected you to fight for them, to plead, to question your worth. But laughter signaled something else. They weren't worth resistance. Nothing damages an ego more than realizing you weren't important enough to provoke emotion. Pain didn't turn you into a victim. It turned you into something quieter, more observant, more strategic. Betrayal didn't break you. It activated awareness, and awareness changes how you move. You laughed because the version of you emerging wasn't accessible to them anymore. And that's when they started to feel loss. Real loss, not of you, but of the control they thought they had. They finally saw the value of what they lost. Too late. And as that realization settled in, you were already elsewhere mentally. Calm, detached, unbothered. While they remained stuck, trying to understand how they lost leverage without a fight. They stayed behind, replaying the moment again and again, trying to locate the exact second where control slipped through their fingers. Because from their perspective, something didn't add up. There was no explosion, no emotional collapse. No desperate attempt to fix things. Just distance. People. And distance is terrifying to people who survive on reaction. They expected consequences they could manage. Anger they could manipulate. Sadness they could exploit. Questions they could dodge. What they didn't expect was certainty. You didn't argue, because there was nothing left to clarify. You didn't explain because explanations are invitations. You didn't seek closure because closure had already occurred internally. That realization didn't hit them immediately. At first, they assumed you were processing. They assumed silence meant confusion. They assumed space meant time. They were wrong again. Silence wasn't confusion. It was conclusion. Time didn't soften anything. It hardened reality. And slowly, painfully, they began to understand. that the door they thought was temporarily closed had been permanently sealed. That's when regret started to breathe. Not the healthy kind, the selfish kind. Regret rooted in loss of access, loss of influence, loss of relevance. They didn't miss you. They missed how you made them feel important. And that distinction matters. Because when someone misses the value you gave them, instead of the person you were, their remorse is hollow. You sense that long before they reached out. That's why when the messages came, subtle at first, then nostalgic, then guilt-coded, they didn't move you. These civilized people. You'd already outgrown the version of yourself that needed acknowledgement from people like them. You had crossed the emotional point of no return, and they felt it. That's the part no one talks about. People can feel when they no longer have access to your inner world. They can sense when the emotional supply has dried up, when the familiar warmth has been replaced with neutral air. That absence unsettles them because it forces them to sit with themselves. And people who betray others usually don't enjoy their own company. They replayed old conversations, old moments, trying to find a version of you that still cared. But that version was gone. Not angry, not resentful. Gone. You weren't performing strength. You had become it. That's why you didn't feel the urge to prove anything. You didn't need to win. You didn't need validation. These civilized people, you didn't need them to understand. Understanding wasn't your responsibility anymore. They mistook your kindness for permanence. They confused your patience with tolerance. And when patience ends quietly, it leaves people disoriented. They expected consequences they could see. They didn't realize the real consequence was invisibility. You stopped being available, emotionally first, then mentally, then completely. And that progression was deliberate. Because healing doesn't always look like recovery. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal. You pulled your energy back, without announcement, without warning, without negotiation. That withdrawal changed everything. They noticed it in the smallest ways. Your absence from conversations, your lack of curiosity, the way your responses lost warmth and urgency. You weren't cold, you were done. And done is colder than anger. Anger still engages, done disengages. They tried to provoke something. A reaction, a crack. But you didn't flinch. Because once you stop expecting anything from someone, people, they lose leverage. That's the moment power shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, silently. They began to understand that the betrayal didn't destroy you. It exposed them. And exposure is terrifying. When you've built your identity on illusion, they had convinced themselves they were irreplaceable. Your absence proved otherwise. Light went on. You went on calmer, clearer, lighter. That contrast haunted them, because they expected your suffering to validate their actions. They needed you to fall apart so they could justify what they did. Your stability dismantled that narrative. You weren't supposed to thrive without them. That realization forced them into an uncomfortable truth. They weren't the source of your strength. They were just a passenger. And passengers don't get to dictate direction. They reached the stage where memories started to hurt. not because they were meaningful, but because they represented something lost permanently. Access. Once access is gone, well, no apology restores it. Because apologies fix mistakes, not patterns. And betrayal is never accidental. It's a choice repeated in smaller ways, long before it becomes visible. You didn't need revenge. Distance did the work for you. Because distance doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. These civilized people, it doesn't forgive prematurely. It teaches, they learn too late, that you were never dependent on them. You were invested. An investment can be withdrawn. They felt the absence of your loyalty first. That was the real loss. Your loyalty was quiet, consistent, protective. Once removed, the environment changed. They noticed how quickly things became unstable. How much effort it took to replace what you offered effortlessly. Care can't be replicated with charm. Stability can't be faked with excuses. They realized they lost something rare. Not because you were perfect, but because you were genuine. And genuine people don't stay where they aren't respected. You didn't announce your departure. You simply stopped showing up. That's how grown detachment works. No speeches, no ultimatums, just absence. They told themselves stories to cope. That you'd come back. That this was temporary. That you'd miss them. But deep down, they knew better. Because your silence didn't feel emotional. It felt final. They wanted forgiveness. People. Not to heal the relationship, but to ease their conscience. And forgiveness without access terrifies people who rely on control. You didn't block them out of spite. You removed them out of self-respect. That difference defines growth. You didn't harden your heart. You refined it. You learned that not everyone deserves the same level of access. That boundaries aren't punishments, they're filters. And once that understanding settled in, peace followed. Not excitement, not euphoria. Peace. The kind that doesn't need noise to exist. Meanwhile, they remained restless because people who betray others often repeat the pattern. They carry the same insecurity into new connections. They look for replacements. Who tolerate what you refused? But comparisons linger. Because standards don't disappear. They realize something else too. They didn't just lose you. They lost the version of themselves that felt better around you. Your presence reflected something positive back at them. Without it, they felt smaller. That's why regret turned into bitterness, and bitterness into rationalization. They tried to minimize you in their mind, to rewrite history. But reality has weight, and truth doesn't bend easily. You weren't dramatic. You weren't destructive. You were dignified, and dignity leaves a deeper imprint than chaos ever could. They wondered why you never returned to demand accountability, why you never exposed them, why you never sought justice. The answer was simple. Well, you didn't need to. Life handles imbalance on its own timeline. You trusted that, because when someone betrays genuine loyalty, they eventually face the absence of it everywhere. Not as punishment, as consequence. You moved forward, not rushed, not forced, just aligned. You invested your energy elsewhere, into growth, into clarity, into people who reciprocated without calculation. That shift changed you. You became more selective, more observant, less forgiving of repeated disrespect. Not bitter. Aware. And awareness is permanent. They saw you change from a distance, more confident, more contained, more deliberate. They realized the betrayal didn't damage you. It upgraded you. And that realization stung, because it meant their attempt to feel powerful had the opposite effect. You weren't broken. You were refined. They had expected to be a turning point in your pain. Instead, they became a footnote in your evolution. That's when they truly lost. Because people who betray others want significance. They want to be remembered as impactful. Your indifference denied them that legacy. You didn't erase them angrily. You outgrew them quietly. And quiet endings haunt louder than dramatic ones. They waited for karma to come from you. It never did. Because karma doesn't need assistance. Life has a way of balancing energy, and you trusted that balance. You focused on becoming unreachable to patterns that no longer served you. Not emotionally numb, emotionally disciplined. Now, that distinction matters. You didn't close your heart, you protected it. They wanted closure. They wanted a conversation where they could explain themselves. But explanations don't undo choices. And you had already accepted reality. Closure doesn't come from dialogue. It comes from decision. People. You decided, and once a decision is internalized, there's nothing left to discuss. They felt that. They sensed that no version of words could reopen the door. Because the door wasn't closed in anger. It was closed in clarity. You stopped negotiating with people who had already shown you their limits. And limits are not challenges, they're warnings. You listened. They didn't. Now the roles had reversed. They waited. You moved on, they reflected. You progressed, they wondered. You evolved. And in that contrast, the truth became unavoidable. They lost access to someone they could never replace. Not because you were extraordinary in performance, but because you were consistent in character. Character is rare, and rare things, once lost, are felt long after they're gone. You didn't celebrate their downfall. You didn't need to. Your peace was enough. Because peace is the ultimate sign that betrayal failed. It didn't poison you. It purified you. You didn't become colder. You became clearer. And clarity changes everything. You now recognize patterns faster. You trust intuition sooner. You detach without guilt. Not because you stopped caring, but because you learned who deserves it. The betrayal didn't harden your heart. It sharpened your standards. That's the quiet victory. No applause. No announcement. Just a life that no longer includes what disrespected it. They remain a lesson, not a wound. And lessons don't hurt forever, they instruct. You laugh then because you saw the ending. You smile now because you lived beyond it. The story didn't end with betrayal. It began with freedom. And freedom doesn't make noise. It simply moves on.